Hello and welcome to the Pakistan-United States Alumni Network's Energy and the Environment Interest Group. I'm your host and moderator for today's topic, Environmental Laws into Action, from Challenges to Solutions. The issue bears great significance given the recent events of the past few days, weeks, and months. Earlier this year, we saw Texas freeze with temperatures dropping to as low as minus 15 degrees. We are recently witnessing the climate-induced famine in Madagascar, devastating floods in Germany and China, wildfires in Greece, Spain, Turkey, and California, heat waves across Europe and North America, and an earthquake in Haiti as recent as last week. We literally saw the Gulf of Mexico on fire just over a month ago. Previously, there was uncertainty, but now there isn't. Now, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its recent report, has come out and said that it is unequivocal from these events, that these events are due to human activity, and that human activity is responsible for climate change. This is a sharp departure from previous IPCC reports. This time, they haven't pulled any punches, they haven't minced any words, and so the precise science of attribution has made it unavoidable for politicians and corporations to hide behind the veneer of uncertainty. The events in Texas also highlighted another issue. It demonstrated the inadequacy of our existing infrastructure. Due to lack of weatherization, gas, nuclear, coal, and wind power plants all froze, water pipelines burst, depriving people of basic utilities such as heat, water, electricity, for days and weeks. Our planning and construction is all based on historical data and does not cater to the vicissitudes of this extreme weather, which is expected to continue given that it is inevitable that we'll cross the 1.5 degrees threshold that Paris Agreement thought that ideally we'll meet, and that we are on course for 3 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. We are currently on track for only 0.5%, 0.5% of cut in global emissions from 2010 levels by 2030, when what we actually need is a 45% drop to avoid a climate catastrophe. Besides this global context, Pakistan has its own set of unique challenges. It is among the top 10 most climate affected countries in the world, as indicated by the Global Climate Risk Index. We have the melting glaciers up north, the rising seas in the north, the rising seas in the south. We have a heavily agriculture-based economy, which will suffer considerably due to climate change. Additionally, the people in Pakistan are also suffering from a terrible air pollution. Air pollution is considered worse than cigarette smoking or even war. The air quality index in Pakistan's major cities ranks from unhealthy to hazardous, with Karachi and Lahore ranking among cities that have the worst air quality in the world. Moreover, Pakistan's Indus River is the second most plastic polluted river in the world. It's all deeply concerning. And so in this context, it is imperative that we speak about our existing environmental laws and regulatory frameworks, assess what is not, and figure out what is not working. How do we turn it all around? To discuss all this, we have an esteemed panel of experts, and I'm really looking forward to our discussions with them today. And without any further delay, I'll invite Ms. Ramisa Aditya Verman, who is the Environment, Science, Health, and Technology Officer here at the US Embassy in Islamabad, to say a few words. Ramisa?
Thank you, Humzah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome, alumni, guests, and distinguished panelists in the United States and Pakistan, to our collaborative effort from the Pakistan-U.S. Alumni Network, or PUAN, and the U.S. mission in Pakistan's effort in putting environmental laws into action. So we'll be talking about challenges and solutions today under the PUAN Environment and Energy Interest Group. As Humzah mentioned, my name is Ramisa Aditya Verman. I'm the new Environment, Science, Technology, and Health Officer here in U.S. Embassy in Islamabad. I've had the great fortune of seeing some familiar faces here, so it's great to see you all again. As you all are aware, the goal of this interest group is to address the needs and challenges in environment and energy and to really create a network of experts in collaborative, applicable solutions. So this effort promotes both US and Pakistan interests in strengthening our bilateral relationship on these ever important issues. And so environmental crises and combating climate change are major priorities for the Biden administration, as we know. In January, President Biden signed the instrument for the United States to rejoin the Paris Agreement. And ever since, the United States has aggressively renewed its commitment to fighting climate change and engaging leaders around the world to accelerate cooperation on climate. In April, President Biden's Leaders Summit on Climate was one marker in which the United States set in a US emissions target of 50 to 52% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. Other countries have made ambitious commitments, and we continue to encourage those to make even greater commitments. And as we get closer to COP26 this November, we look forward to seeing the whole world be on board, be committed, and take the steps necessary to limit global warming. And of course, on the forefront of this fight against climate change are our environmental practitioners, including those experts in environmental law. So let me just take this moment again, on behalf of the US mission in Pakistan, thank you to our speakers, Karol Boudreaux in DC from USaid, Rafay and Hadika Jamshaid from here in Pakistan, and of course our session moderator, Humzah. Thank you for being here and for participating in what I know will be a useful collaboration in addressing not only environmental laws, but really translating our learning into some actions that can help both our local communities and our global communities. So I'm looking forward to this wonderful session, and back to you, Humzah. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Renessa. Our first speaker today is Karol Boudreaux. Karol is the Senior Land and Resource Governance Advisor at USaid, where she supports USaid missions, bureaus, and offices to design, develop, and implement activities to secure land rights and to create policies that reflect the key role land plays in promoting developing objectives. Her talk today about environmental law and climate crisis will also cover the importance of wetlands when considering infrastructure development and the trade-offs that it entails. Karol, the Zoom is all yours.
Thank you so very much, Humzah. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to embassy colleagues and all of you from PUAN. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here with you. So today, as Humzah said, I will be speaking about three main issues. First, I'll talk a little bit about US environmental law. Then I'll talk about US policies related to climate change, and I'll close with a very brief discussion of USAID's forthcoming climate strategy. But to begin and to give us a framing for the conversation, I wanted to suggest the following: that environmental law is in many ways crisis response law. Over the last 50 years here in the United States, there have been key crises events that have resulted in calls for new environmental laws. These started with crises of polluted water and polluted air, maybe turned to the crisis of polluted soil, focused on issues of endangered species. And this is just a few of the issues that have been addressed. But as Humzah really poignantly noted for us, now we are in a climate crisis. So in the face of these multiple crises, US lawmakers really have turned away from the previous way of addressing environmental issues, which was through common law protections, and instead have created a wide array of federal statutes that are designed, of course, to protect human health, to help promote economic growth and protect property, as well as to protect nature, ecosystems, habitats, and species. I want to just remind us, though, that this has been done in a piecemeal fashion. It's been done bit by bit in response to each new crisis or perceived crisis. So US environmental law is certainly not a highly coherent, carefully planned out approach. It's instead a response to demands from multiple constituents to address many problems. These problems may be interrelated and they change over time. And these efforts to protect and conserve come at a cost, just as failure to protect imposes costs. So let me give you an example. Protecting wetlands costs a certain amount, but that protection delivers certain benefits. I'm going to talk about some of those benefits in a few moments. I want to note that the cost is largely that by protecting and conserving wetlands, we necessarily forego some development that could also deliver other benefits, again, at a particular cost. The cost of lost wetlands and the services they provide, which are substantial. So we have a deep problem of trade-offs here. For those of you who are involved in energy, not a sector I'm really involved with, we could also consider the example of changing building energy codes to require that buildings are constructed in a way that conserves energy and avoids CO2 emissions. Savings and reduced emissions, these can be really substantial over time, but these savings come at a financial cost that consumers will bear, and those costs may have disparate impacts on the poor. So to say, in a complex, dynamic world with incomplete information, how do we think about and address environmental trade-offs? That's an always present big question, and one we can keep in mind and may be able to discuss in more detail during the questions and answers. But for now, let me turn very quickly to the environmental law framework in the US. We are, like Pakistan, a federal system. So we have environmental laws at each level of government, federal, state, and local. At the federal level, multiple departments and agencies do work related to environmental protection, both domestically in the US and overseas. So you may or may not be familiar with our suite of statutes, but just a few include the Atomic Energy Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Energy Independence and Security Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, and I could go on and on. There is a very long list of these. But in addition to these federal statutes, there are executive orders that apply to environmental issues, and there are other laws that help us interpret environmental laws like the Administrative Procedures Act. And finally, on top of this formal law, this de jure law, there is private governance and voluntary environmental commitments or standards that the private sector produces. So as you can tell, in the United States, there already is quite a lot of environmental law. But at the moment, we do not have a comprehensive national legal and policy framework to address climate change. So at this moment, in this crisis, it's actually not clear if the United States wants to, or all the people of the United States, to put it more appropriately, if the people of the US want to or need to adjust the piecemeal approach we've taken. But it does mean that right now there is no national law on things like carbon pricing or carbon markets. I can say it does seem like we have some important missing pieces and some important gaps in the law. But the federal government and state governments can and they will draft new laws, such as the infrastructure spending and budget bills that are at the US Congress right now, which do include significant investments in and incentives for clean energy to address the problem Humzah raised of modernizing the electric grid, to invest in fuel sources like hydrogen, to support carbon capture, to build more electric vehicle charging stations to help support the transition to electric vehicles, and to shift government procurement processes so that the government itself is procuring electric vehicles for its fleets. So we can have new laws, and these are in the works, but states and the federal government can also build on existing statutes that protect people or seek to protect people and the environment. And I'm going to talk very briefly about just a couple of these. For example, the Clean Air Act requires that the Environmental Protection Agency work directly with states to reduce a whole variety of air pollutants, including GHG emissions, that come from many sources, not just industrial sources, but also landfills. And among other issues, the Environmental Protection Agency and the US Army Corps of Engineers are charged with protecting and conserving wetlands in the US. This is an area where the Department of Agriculture also has a role to play. So now I'm going to turn back to wetlands for a moment and talk about why, for climate change purposes, these areas are really important to conserve. We all recognize that the frequency of floods, hurricanes, typhoons, and droughts is increasing. And we also know that according to UN Water, 90% of all natural hazards are water related. These disasters have an enormous human and economic toll. Over 1.5 million people have died in these disasters since 1996, and damage costs associated with these disasters run in the trillions of dollars. At the same time, coastal and inland wetlands are important natural solutions to these problems. They act as a barrier or a buffer for natural disasters. They provide flood protection and shoreline erosion control. They store and release water, which can help modulate the effects of drought and water shortages. They store carbon, particularly peatlands, which might store 2 times as much carbon as all of the world's forests. Wetlands also filter water, and they serve as habitats for many species, some of which provide important sources of protein for communities. And so they help support food systems. In other words, they provide extremely valuable ecosystem services. Okay, but back to our discussion of trade-offs. What actually is the best strategy to protect these resources? Is it by designating them as protected areas? Or is it through community management of resources? Is it through a combination of these approaches? Which wetlands should be protected? Should every single wetland be protected, or only high priority areas? Should a wetland's loss always be offset by restoration someplace else? How do we prioritize conservation and restoration versus other important needs, and particularly economic development needs? And a very important question in the US, how should we manage floodplains where so many citizens live and work versus other needs and concerns related to the environment? So in the US, our policies tell us to conserve, to restore in order to offset wetlands losses, and to make pretty ample use of subsidies to prevent drainage and conversion of wetlands. In some areas right now, the Florida Everglades would be a key example. The government is actually trying to figure out how to undo the results of earlier engineering efforts to make wetlands more usable, primarily for agriculture. And this reversion effort is extraordinarily costly. So back to the trade-offs question, wetlands can be a very effective natural solution for climate change. And we do have laws for conserving them, but are we fully taking into account the costs associated with that conservation? And is what we're already doing good enough? All right, so I'm going to turn away from wetlands, which is a very good topic for a land and resource governance advisor, to just very briefly mention 2 acts that deal with energy given this group. The first is the Energy Policy Act, or EPACT, which in the US focuses on things like promoting appliance energy efficiency standards and updating commercial building codes to make sure they're energy efficient. Promoting renewable energy, including through tax credits for wind and solar, and some pretty substantial support for biofuels like ethanol. This law served as H.W. Bush administration's submission to the UNFCCC, but responsibilities, which is very common in the US, responsibilities for implementing the act are split between the Department of Energy and Interior. The follow-on Energy Independence and Security Act addresses renewable energy conservation. It extended the use of renewable fuels with lower GHG emissions, and it supports research on mitigating and addressing the effects of climate change, particularly on transportation and through carbon capture. And here again, the Department of Interior has a role to play. They assess the potential for carbon capture and storage in different ecosystems or geologies. So this is a painfully abbreviated look at how just a few US laws might be used to address climate change. And there's more we could discuss, but I'm going to very briefly touch on new administration policies and priorities. And We got a quick introduction to this already. As Renisa mentioned, when President Biden took office, he rejoined immediately the Paris Agreement and created a national climate task force to develop the new USG emission target for our NDC, which is a 50 to 52% reduction in US greenhouse gas emissions from the 2005 level by 2030. So a pretty ambitious target. The administration's focused on developing a carbon pollution-free electricity sector by 2035 and a net zero emissions economy by no later than 2050. How do we get there? Okay, well, here's sort of where the rubber meets the road through significantly expanded investment in infrastructure and innovation, hence the big infrastructure bill in front of Congress this week. A lot of emphasis on leveraging private sector funding to promote innovation and support a variety of changes on the ground, entrepreneurial change, support for upgrades in energy efficiency, support for renewable energy production and green jobs. I mentioned electric vehicles already, with a goal of requiring half of all vehicles sold by 2030 be electric. New incentives to decarbonize supply chains, an important focus on reducing emissions from forests and agriculture to enhance carbon sinks, both here in the US and overseas. There's a fair amount of interesting work going on blue carbon, and then recognizing that climate change is really an important and integral part of US foreign policy and national security. To support all of this work here at USAID, we're developing a new climate strategy, and that strategy will be available rather for external comment and review in early September. We'd be delighted to have PUAN take a look at it. Our strategy is a whole of agency strategy that takes a somewhat longer term perspective. It's proposed to run through 2030. And it's focusing on pursuing ambitious, sustained climate actions in partnership with traditional and newer partners to accelerate and scale these actions and help move us towards net zero and climate resilience. So I'm going to just briefly talk, and then I'll close out about some of what we're planning to do. First of all, importantly, the agency is proposing to improve its own operations and approaches to address climate and to address climate justice. Of course, the strategy has a strong focus on, as it would, mitigation and adaptation, including emissions from the energy sector, with a focus on scaling up renewable systems, supporting low emissions transport, and improving energy efficiency and energy grids with our partner governments. We have a focus in the current draft strategy on addressing deforestation, both due to ag and other land uses. Continued support for early warning systems like USAID's FuseNet system and other services, which might include integrating climate information into healthcare, into education activities, into and support for green jobs, and to build capacity for and address the impacts of climate. Very big emphasis on climate finance, disaster risk finances and services to promote adaptation. This could be through loan guarantees, insurance, or investments in green supply chains. But perhaps one of the newest elements of the proposed draft strategy is a focus on equitable and inclusive actions to support Indigenous peoples, youth, and women as key stakeholders in climate conversations. And improved coordination and collaboration between our humanitarian and development programs. So I'll note again that we anticipate this strategy to be available for external review the very first week of September, and would really welcome feedback from this group. So for me, that's a very quick look, super high level at US environmental law, our climate policies, and what's coming next from USAID on climate. So with that, let me thank you for your kind attention and turn the floor back to Humzah. Thank you, Humzah.
Thank you so much, Karol, for that very informative talk and for really explaining the US strategy when it comes to protecting the environment. You're right, it's a balance of sticks and carrots, mandates and incentives. And I think one thing in the question and answer that we can probably touch upon is, if we have to clean the energy grid, how do we have to lay the transmission distribution lines, which have and a land component to it. At the same time, there's this NIMBY phenomenon, which is not in my backyard. And so, how does land play a role in all that? And how do we move to that clean energy grid and still overcome all those problems? Next up, we have Mr. Ahmad Rafay Alam. Mr. Ahmad Rafay Alam is an environmental lawyer and a partner at Saleem, Alam and Company, a law firm specializing in energy, water, natural resources, and urban infrastructure sectors. He's a Yale World Fellow and serves on a number of boards. He's also a member of the Pakistan Climate Change Council and Punjab Environmental Protection Council. Mr. Alamstock will cover the recent intergovernmental panel on climate change report, the Paris Agreement, the failure of the international climate response, as well as Pakistan's climate policy, which includes Pakistan's new renewable portfolio standard of 60%, as well as its electric vehicle policy. Over to you, Rafay.
Thank you very much, Humzah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I want to thank the Pakistan-U.S. Alumni Network for inviting me to speak about the climate crisis. I'm going to break my talk into 3 or 4 parts. First, addressing some of my concerns about the international response to the climate crisis, and then focusing a little bit about some issues on Pakistan law and policy, and then trying to wind up with some of my thoughts about how we can respond to the climate crisis. Now, we all know that greenhouse gases are the cause of global warming. As a matter of fact, I believe this last July was the hottest ever recorded in human history. So it's greenhouse gases that are causing these rather rapid increases in global temperatures. And it was, a long time ago, actually in the middle of the 19th century, there was a woman, Liza Foote, who somewhere in the 1850s in the American Association for Sciences submitted a paper hypothesizing about the impacts of carbon monoxide and carbon pollution in the atmosphere. The first person, incidentally, to recognize the potential of greenhouse gases warming the atmosphere was a woman. But it was in 1992 that the international community got together to do something about greenhouse gases. Remember, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed in 1992 in Rio, and the objective of which is to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions at a level that will prevent dangerous human interference in ecological systems. Now, this objective was manifest in the Kyoto Protocol, which sought to keep global warming to no more than 2 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial levels by a compulsory cap and trade mechanism. Countries were actually restricted on how much they could pollute, and the hope was that those restrictions over time would mean that global warming wouldn't increase beyond 2 degrees centigrade over the course of the century. I note that the US Senate failed to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. That was the time during President Clinton's time. I just want to point out that 2 degrees and this 1.5 that we hear about in the Paris Agreement are not like speed limits that damage starts happening after we pass those global warming limits. You have to understand there's no safe amount of global warming. Humzah just went through a list of things that have happened just this year. And we must understand, therefore, that this 2 degrees or 1.5 degree limits, these notional hypothetical limits, are actually the most amount of political catastrophe international leaders are willing to bear. And it was, amongst many other things, calls from the small island states like the Maldives, like the Seychelles, saying that at 2 degrees warming, their countries, their islands would be submerged under the ocean, that sought to increase the ambition to reduce global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade in the Paris Agreement of 2016. A remarkable feat of negotiation by Secretary Kerry. But one nugget, very important, very different from the Kyoto Protocol, and to make it more palatable for the US Congress to ratify, was that the Paris Agreement was made voluntary, where countries were supposed to submit their own nationally determined contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. Nationally determined means voluntary. And although the text of the Paris Agreement says that this has to be the most ambitious reduction that countries can take, what has truly happened since the Paris Agreement, since these assessments keep on coming in, is that we find that commitments that have been submitted under the Paris Agreement fail to keep the world under 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's essentially what the recent IPCC report has said. In fact, forget about stabilization. There have been more greenhouse gases produced since 1992, that is the UNFCCC, since they were ever compared to ever before in human history. In other words, the objective of the UNFCCC has failed. There is no stabilization of greenhouse gases. In fact, some doomsday scenarios speakers suggest that we could burst through 2 degrees of warming by the end of 2040. That would be devastating. Now, not just that, not just the UNFCC it comes under question, its objectives come under question, but some of the legal principles that it has worked off of also come under question. And the one I want to specifically refer to is this idea of the common but differentiated responsibility, which is a very important concept that recognizes historical equity and the idea of reparations, especially against less developed countries who have not had a hand in global economic development and the industrialization which has brought our civilization to this peril. But common but differentiated responsibilities, now I want to speak about Pakistan, give countries like Pakistan, which submitted its INDC in 2016, but instead of posting a reduction to greenhouse gases, estimated that in the period between 2015 and 2020, Pakistan's greenhouse gases would increase by a factor of 400%. Basically bolstered by the CPEC negotiations that were taking place at the time, most of which included coal-based power plants for Pakistan. Now, I understand we're a poor country. I understand we're not a large greenhouse gas emitter, but the truth is that right now in Pakistan, in the energy sector, which is one of the major contributors to greenhouse gases, and I'm quoting NEPRA tariffs, that's Pakistan's energy regulator, its own tariffs suggest that renewable electricity in Pakistan is cheaper across the board compared to any other type of fossil fuel electricity, and also including hydel. So energy is not only environmentally friendly and good for the air, it's also financially sustainable. And I, for one, cannot understand why Pakistan continues to execute long-term fossil fuel contracts with international entities that commit it to a future of climate crisis. There are some issues regarding law and policy in Pakistan as well. And I'll start with the Ministry of Climate Change. The subject of climate change is a federal subject. Pakistan's a federation, mostly because we are signatory to a number of international climate agreements which require the ministry to perform a reporting task, reporting back to the secretariat of these international agreements, Pakistan's performance in its implementation. However, like I said, many of the subjects of greenhouse gases in Pakistan, most notably energy, transport, and even agriculture, agriculture is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases, are actually subjects of governance of the provincial governments and not the federal governments. What we need is coordination between the federal government Ministry of Climate Change, which is reporting on these international agreements, and the provinces, the departments of which are actually responsible for the implementation of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And there is no formal connective tissue between the federating units and the federation when it comes to the implementation of international agreements, the subject of which are provincial in nature. Pakistan is very lucky to have a national climate change policy. It was passed in 2012, around about the time of the 18th Amendment, which means this policy is not only about a decade old, but also needs to be revised in light of the province's new responsibilities to have their own climate policies. You see, climate change is very localized. The impacts in KP and its forests will be very different from its impacts in Quetta, which will be very different from its impacts even within a province. How Lahore is susceptible to climate change is radically different from how Islamabad or even Sialkot are. And so we need not just provincial policies, we need localized policies that provide some sort of idea of the impacts we're going to suffer and the type of interventions we can have and adaptations we can put into place. Pakistan's also very lucky to have a climate legislation from 2017. And without getting into the question of whether or not this should be federal or provincial, I want to point out that this legislation creates an environment council, which Humzah mentioned I'm a member of, the responsibility of which is to formulate climate policies for Pakistan. The elected representatives of Pakistan felt that the formulation of climate policy was something so specialist and something that which required the participation of provinces, that a council was created headed by the Prime Minister and also consisting of the chief ministers of the provinces and the provincial ministers for environment, supported by a bunch of experts who would formulate climate policy. This policy would then be implemented by a statutory authority, a national climate authority. And I noticed that after 4 years of this legislation, and although I'm a member of the council has never convened once, and the authority has not yet been manned. Now, I also want to acknowledge some of the initiatives this Pakistani government has made with respect to climate change. For example, the 10 billion tree tsunami, its electric vehicle policy, and its commitment to bring 60% of Pakistan's energy resources from renewable by the end of this decade. But I want to point out that these are federal government initiatives that have not passed through the correct statutory forum, which is the Climate Council. And yet, and so therefore they remain purely government initiatives not covered by statute. And if you look at these initiatives, the electric vehicle policy is ambitious, and I hope it well, but this year's budget also gave a subsidy to fossil fuel and combustion engine automobile makers in Pakistan, specifically to the low end, the cheaper model vehicles. That's one step forward and 2 steps back. And as far as the energy policy of Pakistan is concerned, in this idea that we'll move to 60% renewables by 2030, Afia, who I haven't said a hello to and who's participating here, just today tweeted a report from GSCC that said that Pakistan's fossil fuel energy actually went up by about 17% in 2021. So while there's a commitment on one side, the practice seems to be going somewhere else. These things need to be addressed. How do we address them? People ask me, what do we do about climate change? Humzah, how much time do I have?
About 5 minutes.
All right, let me wind up with this, because people do ask me what we can do about climate change. And I'm remembering this article The Guardian published, I think 2 days ago, talking about how Ogilvy, which is an advertising company, was actually engaged to come up with this idea of carbon footprint, which is a cunning way of shifting responsibility of the climate crisis onto us individual consumers, rather than the very few corporations and billionaires that are primarily responsible for this problem. Let me speak about why we're in this situation. Because we've had greenhouse gases before, we didn't have climate change. We had trade, we had mercantile business, but we didn't have climate change. What is going on in our world today that has brought us to this civilizational precipice? There are many commentators on this, but it's my belief that there are 4 main drivers to climate change, 4 or 5, and these include capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, and consumerism. You can add the fossil fuel economy to that as well. And let me explain each one of these before you start accusing me of being a socialist feminist, which incidentally I am. But when I say capitalism, what I mean is a system, it's a global way of doing business and enterprise, which allows for the unaccountable exploitation of resources and human capital for profit. And what I mean by unaccountable is the staggering statistic that there are only 90 companies in the world responsible for 2/3 of all historical greenhouse gas emissions. That sort of inequity, that sort of anomaly can only exist when you have unaccountability and the exploitation of resources and human beings. And we need a business system, a global business system that does not allow that, and which allows for the respect of the environment and the climate and human capital. The same is true with patriarchy, which is a system of consumption where the man is at the middle, creating a systemic discrimination against women in all spheres. But more importantly, we need women in decision-making every single place, because not a single mitigation or adaptation strategy will work unless women were at the table making decisions about what they look like. And we need to have, especially in Pakistan, more women in decision-making. Colonialism, especially settler colonialism, where imperialist powers took over other parts of the world and exploited their resources, is another cause for climate change. These resources were exploited from countries like Indonesia, their oil, from Pakistan, and India, a lot of its textiles, for feeding the industry of the West. And it's this type of economic exploitation, of which there are modern examples as well, that need to be dismantled if we want anything to do about hoping if we want anything to do about the climate crisis. And lastly, consumerism, because a lot of what we are driven by, a lot of what the climate crisis is driven by, is our own habits, human habits of consumption. But I want to make a very important point here, which is that human beings do not consume equally. I'm a middle-class Pakistani. I consume a certain amount of energy, but it's huge amounts compared to someone from a rural area in Pakistan. You cannot put the world's large majority poor in the same basket as the global elite. And we know that only 10% of the global elite consume 50% of its resources. It's this consumption that we have to control, because it's this very, very select, very, very minute elite consumption that's driving climate change. And we know who these people are, and we know who these corporations are, and we have to dismantle these systems if we have a hope about doing anything about the climate crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rafay, for that great talk. You're absolutely right. And your views are not too very different from Naomi Klein, who's the author of This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Environment. That consumerism and capitalism has given us climate change. And I'm glad that you tackle the criticism that people get, like, that people are watermelons, green from the outside, red from the inside. So I'm glad you tackle that head on. Next up, and by the way, Rafay, I've got loads of questions. And so, once we are done with Hadika's talk, we'll pose some questions and have a great discussion as well. Jamshaid, the ministry in building climate change resilience infrastructure for achieving nationally determined contributions and localizing carbon market tools for sustainable development and air pollution control in Pakistan. Her presentation will be on Pakistan's current climate change situation, the ministry's priorities and projects. Hadika, over to you.
Thank you so much, Humzah, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel discussion, and it was great to hear all the panelists before me talking about the climate change issue, especially what Karol was talking about. All the issues and all the projects and initiatives she mentioned, somewhere Pakistan is working on that. Some of the projects are in pipeline, some are in the process of initiating. Let it be if it's on carbon markets, on EVs, on green jobs, and on youth involvement in climate change action, and also on air pollution and the link between air pollution and GHG inventory. I will start my presentation if your communication team can show it on the screen. I'm sorry, I thought there was a presentation. I just made one.
Okay, Hadika, I have enabled the settings from my side. Shayla here, Communications Officer, PUAN USAFP. If you want to play them yourselves, feel free to do that. Otherwise, I can simply start sharing my screen by sharing your slides.
If you can share the screen, that would be great.
Okay,
Thank you.
okay. Just give me a minute then. Okay.
I'm trying from my side, but I think my Zoom is not updated.
It's all right. It's all right. If anyone can please confirm that, can you guys see my screen? I am showing something saying, we're just saying the climate focus of Pakistan.
Yeah.
Okay. Over to you, Hadika.
Thank you so much. So just to set a stage and to give a snapshot of Pakistan, what Pakistan is doing, and I won't get into the UNFCCC and NDCs. I think Rafay has covered that area quite well for Pakistan, and not repeating all that. But Pakistan contribute less than 1% of the emissions of the world. Emissions of the world, and if you can see in this foot infographic, Pakistan's share is quite less, and the per capita income, per capita metric ton is also lower in compared to other countries, the major leading country, USA, Saudi, and China. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges which we face, one of the major one is rapid urbanization. Pakistan is a rapidly urbanizing country, one of the most rapid urbanization country in South Asia. About 36.4% of the people are residing in urban areas, which result in many issues like air pollution, congestion, waste management issues, and also issues related to emissions from the electric vehicle, cars, and also building emissions. Then there's energy insecurity, which I don't want to get into because all the people over here are energy experts. So this is something which is a major issue. And according to the Economic Survey of Pakistan, the supply and demand gap of energy is quite low, and we need to have a better energy mix to tackle this issue. Then there's a issue of water scarcity, where Pakistan right now is a water stressed country, but by 2025, we are expected to be one of the most water stressed country of South Asia. This remains one of the major issues for Pakistan as well. Then the vulnerability to climate change. Pakistan is among the top 10 countries which are most impacted by climate change for the last 20 years. And this is due to the 152 disasters we have faced in the last 20 years also. And this resulted in almost 4,000 USD million losses, and of 0.5% unit of GDP as well. So all these challenges which we are facing right now, and top of that, we have a COVID-19 situation. And according to the State Bank report, since the fiscal year started from 1951, we have not seen a negative growth. This was the only year which we have seen the negative growth. So all this combined together results in a bigger challenge for Pakistan, how to deal with this emerging challenge of climate change. However, there is a lot of opportunities which we can tap into. We have a huge potential for renewable energy. We have a very rich ecosystem when it comes to from Himalayas to all the areas to the coastal and mangroves. So there is a huge opportunities which we can tap into and gain out of that. Then we have a huge youth population, which is about 68% of the population right now. And this population can actually, if we remain very realistic and not being very ambitious, we can let them in a way which they can play a very significant role in achieving our climate change goals. And currently we are involved with them on different goals, which results, we have a project on youth startup project where it's called Hackathon, where we are tapping into different youth startups to fund them to create green jobs. Then there's a concept of translating the curriculums into local languages so that we can reach to the masses and increase the awareness of the youth population. Then there's a educate the educator concept, where we are going to different rural areas to educate the influential members of the society and the teachers so that they can educate it further. Then there's a carbon market, which I will be touching upon in more detail later on. Next slide, please. Coming to the projects Pakistan is doing currently, the flagship project of 10 billion tsunami tree, which was mentioned by my previous speaker as well. This project and the Green Stimulus project, both the projects are funded by the indigenous resources of Pakistan. So these are all government funded projects. 10 billion tsunami tree is around 110 billion rupees project, out of which 98 is for the forest and 12 is for the wildlife. This project is creating thousands of green jobs till now, and also under green stimulus package after COVID-19, we targeted 10 billion tsunami tree and Clean in Pakistan movement project, which was also a project initiated by Prime Minister of Pakistan back in 2018. Under these two projects, what Ministry of Climate Change targeted was to create 2 lakh green jobs, focusing again on youth and gender. And till now, we have created almost 150,000 jobs. So these two projects are quite significant for us, and this shows the commitment of Pakistan that we are investing our own resources to achieve the goals of climate change. And according to which will be published soon, our updated GHG inventory, 9% of the emissions in the forest sectors were reduced after this billion tree tsunami project was completed. Next slide, please. These are high priority areas of ecosystem restoration. Back in 2019, we launched our initiative of ecosystem restoration in Madrid at COP25. The main aim was to to do projects under nature-based solutions. And one of the major ones we started was on the protected area, focusing on 23 protected areas. And the aim is to enhance the protected area from 12 to 15%. And under this as well, we are focusing to create more jobs, green jobs. Till now, we have created 5,000 green jobs in this initiative, and also to encourage the ecotourism in these areas. Then we have a blue carbon, which Karol also mentioned. We recently did an assessment with World Bank and blue carbon will be part of our updated NDCs, which we are revising currently. That assessment was to develop a policy recommendations which can be incorporated in the revised and updated NDCs. According to this assessment, what we saw that the mangrove cover of Pakistan increased in the previous year by 300%, which was a huge increase. And the potential it has to reduce the GHG emission was around 72.2 million metrics. So this shows that a mangrove tree has more potential to reduce greenhouse gases than a normal tree. So according to the assessment, and we are going into a second phase of it, where we are starting a project of 5 years to and to restore the seagrasses and marshes, so that we can have a good quantity of blue carbon, and later on we can explore the carbon market within the blue carbon area as well. And while we were doing this assessment, there's a new concept came up of national capital accounting, where these resources we need to put a dollar value to these resources, so that we can show it to the world as well, and to the Pakistan as well, that these resources are not just we don't need to protect them for climate change, but it has a value as well. So we are starting a project again with World Bank on national capital accounting. Currently we are focusing on 2 protected areas, one in Chitral and one in Ziyarat. But later on, these 2 protected areas framework will be disseminated into all the protected area, and finally to all Pakistan. So these are the projects which are currently going on. Next slide, please. The high priority areas under adaptation, we are currently developing national adaptation plan. And the focus, again, as mentioned before, we are focusing a lot on gender, we are focusing a lot on youth. We have a youth roadmap for the next 5 years. There are several activities which are being done by different agencies. We are developing a gender green jobs roadmap with UNDP. Then there are activities on raising the awareness of youth and involving gender in policy making process. Taking some time to explain the revision process of NDCs we are following. We made these 2 working groups, one on adaptation and one on mitigation. And under each group, there were thematic groups. And we also had under adaptation, we also had group on gender, and we also had group on health, which were these areas and WASH. These areas were not part of our previous NDCs. So the aim of this NDCs is that we enhance our ambitions, we update our policy recommendations, but we also include those areas which were missing in the previous NDCs to make it more holistic, and and we followed a whole of government approach. All these 2 working groups, one was headed by Nika, where Ministry of Energy was heading that, but chaired by Nika, and the other one group on adaptation was headed by Ministry of Water, and it was chaired by Federal Flood Commission. And all the members were from all the provinces. As Rafay rightly said, that we really need to be better in working with the provinces, to enhance the alignment with the provinces, because they play a very significant role. They are the one who will be at the forefront of implementation. Then there was an initiative on climate smart agriculture, Recharge Pakistan. Again, Karol mentioned about wetlands, and this is a project which is under process with GCF and with the support of WWF. We plan to redirect the flood water to recharge our wetlands and aquifers. And then there's the main priority lies in air pollution. We are developing a Pakistan Clean Air program. This first draft was developed back in 2006, but currently we are looking at the current conditions after all the agreements like Paris Agreement, Sendai Framework, and Sustainable Development Goals. Under the light of that, and under the light of current government priorities, this plan is being developed, and they are following a 3-phase approach, which is short-term, medium-term, and long-term. It will be launched soon, and this is supported by World Bank. And the main aim is that we as Karol mentioned very correctly, that we have to align the air pollution and climate change GHG inventory. Basically, all the gases are the same. There is no much diversion. So we need to look at it in a collective way. And the point of these policies and this discussion is that we look at climate change as a cross-cutting rather than in silos. And then there's a forestry initiative, which I've mentioned before, 10 billion tsunami tree. And then we have wash-related initiative, which is the Clean Green Pakistan. We have 5 pillars under Clean Green Pakistan, which includes liquid waste management, solid waste management, clean drinking water, hygiene, and plantation. And all the provinces at the district level are reporting under these 5 thematic areas. They are indicators which are defined, and we are planning. It started from Punjab and KPK. Now we have started this Clean Green Pakistan movement in Balochistan and Sindh, and we are planning to add more indicators related to air pollution and maybe later on carbon market as well. And overall, after the COVID-19, we realized that there's a strong link between human health, animal health, and environment. So the One Health concept is also we are looking into that and planning to have a unit within MOCC so that this can also be looked at and in a more holistic way and in a cross-cutting way. Then the main priorities of mitigation, if you look at it, ARE policy, the goals of ARE policy are very important for MOCC as well. If in order to achieve our NDCs, in order to achieve the goals of climate change, we really hope that these policies also achieve their targets of 20% renewable by 2025 and 30% renewable by 2030. Then we also have an EV policy, which a lot of you guys have mentioned before as well, to achieve 30% of EVs by 2030. And this is something which we are planning to do, and we realize that there are constraints when it comes to infrastructure development, which we are working on. And then we have carbon markets. I have a last slide on this, so I will explain that in more detail. And more related to GHG inventory and MRV system, we realize that in order any mitigation instrument or mitigation intervention to go forward and to be successful, you need a very robust MRV system established within your country. So the data is very important. To updated GHG inventories are very important. Currently, we have sectoral GHG inventories. Ideally, we plan to have provincial GHG inventories as well, so that we can have a better picture and future interventions can be developed looking at those. Next slide, please.
Hadika, just to let you know, we have 1 minute if you can, before we go overboard. So
just the financial one, next slide. I will just go to the carbon market one then, the final slide. Next, yeah, this one. So for the carbon markets, what Pakistan did was we did a study with the UNFCCC to explore different carbon pricing instruments for Pakistan, carbon tax and ETS system, and where the focus was on the energy sector, because this is the most emitting sector of Pakistan. There were several different type of functions were suggested how to go about it. And as Rafay mentioned about the Climate Change Authority and Climate Change Fund, that was proposed that this can be used to establish a carbon market within Pakistan. And later on, we developed a National Carbon Market Establishment Committee, which was presented by all the line ministries at the highest level, and the minister was chairing this committee. And within that, we have been working on developing a domestic ETS framework. Then there is another document we are working on to develop a roadmap for MRV, because as some of you, if you know about carbon markets, very important to have a very robust and a very good data set and MRV system to be successful. And the most important is the communication strategy, which we are working currently. And I want to request everyone over here, if you have anything, any suggestions you want to give, please let me know. We are in the process of collecting all the suggestions from the current stakeholders, because energy sector is the main key stakeholder when it comes to carbon market. And it's very important, before we establish a carbon market, we know what your observations are, what are the things you are looking into, and what are your incentives, so that it can be communicated in that way and it can be taken forward in that way. So yeah, with this, I will finish my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hadika, for that very informative presentation. Before we move to the question and answer session, I believe, Shanila, we have to take a picture. Would that be now, or would we be doing that?
Yep, I guess we can take it like Ranisa, like if you're comfortable, because I really want, because like usually what happens is that people tend to like drop out towards the end. So I just want to make sure that we can capture like multiple faces in our screenshot. So with this, I would like to request everyone who want to be part of this group photo to please turn on their cameras for like 10 seconds or so. Okay, I can still see lots of non-video participants, but for them, I guess they will want to be part of this. Okay, so on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Yay. Let me take another one just in case this one turns out to be like the blurred one. On the count of 3, please. 1, 2, 3. Thank you so much, everyone. Back to our moderator.
Thank you so much. Do we still have Rafay? I think he may have dropped out because I can't see him on the screen.
Yep, I also can't see him. I can't see him either.
Right. Well, does anybody have any questions? Because I have plenty. And so if you all have some questions, please ask Karol or Hadika. And if Rafay joins us again, we can ask questions from him as well.
Humzah, I can see Dr. Asif's hand. I guess he wants to say something.
Yes, please go ahead, Dr. Asif.
Yes, thank you very much, Humzah. I hope you can hear me.
I can hear you very well.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for that response. Very nice presentations, very specific and addressing the important issues related to the environment, the energy sector, as well as the burning issue of climate change. So thank you very much for all of the presentations. I do have a few questions. Rather, it's a question from each speaker. But I'm not sure if Rafay is around. Anyhow, so the first question is addressed to Karol. And since you mentioned in your presentation, and this goes also in terms of the policy approach. So there is no overall policy approach to climate change regulation in the United States. And as I understand, it was the Supreme Court which has held that the United States Environmental Protection Agency has the authority and the obligation to regulate the greenhouse gases pursuant to the Clean Air Act. So in that context, do you think it is likely for the United States to have a federal climate change policy sometime being framed in the future? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'll be happy to answer that. Yes, you're right that the EPA has the primary responsibility for regulating the gases through the Clean Air Act. And of course, state level EPAs also have a role to play in regulating emissions within their borders, and cross-border issues are certainly important. I think what you'll see is actually policies from different departments and agencies over time rather than one consolidated federal climate policy. So I had mentioned, Dr. Khan, that USaid is getting ready to release its policy. Treasury is also, I believe, going through a policy process. So I would expect additional policies coming from the different departments and agencies. And so what that, a bit like US environmental law more broadly, this should result in a crosswalking, right? We should be able to look at each other's policies and make sure that the policy that USaid develops is in line with whatever policy Treasury develops or Commerce develops. And that should happen, again, through an interagency process. But a single federal climate policy, I myself am not aware of that being an activity that's going on at the moment, but it's a very good question. Thank you for that.
Thank you,
Okay, well, thank you very much for the response. And the second question goes to Hadika from the Ministry of Climate Change. So you presented and you gave information about the different interventions that the ministry is undertaking at the moment at the national level. And in relation to that, you also talked about the National Adaptation Plan, which the ministry is currently working on, and I'm aware of that. However, I would like to suggest and also point out that even though the National Adaptation Plan, it may be beneficial, it is highly recommended and suggested, from a local perspective, that there should be local adaptation plans, if not at the provincial level, then at least at the district level, because every area, if you look at the topography of Pakistan, we have a huge range of variation in terms of climates. And therefore, the adaptation plans, they have to be tailored according to those local conditions. So the adaptation plan for the coastal areas has to be different from the adaptation plan in many parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and so on. So even though, as I said, the National Adaptation Plan is going to be beneficial, but in addition to that, there should be local adaptation plans at least at the district level, if not at the tehsil level. And that is going to address the local communities, their problems. All areas have different local climates, and there will be different impacts of these climatic changes at those local areas. And therefore, I believe that the local adaptation plans will also prove highly beneficial. So in that regard, the question is the Ministry of Climate Change communicating with the provincial governments so that they can come up with their local adaptation plans at the district level? Thank you.
Thank you, Asif, for your question. I think your suggestions are well taken, and I will be communicating them to the team working on the National Adaptation Plan. And I agree with you that we need more district level or the provincial level action plans. But as far as I know, this National Adaptation Plan do focus on specific areas and sectors. So, and they will be convening different groups under each thematic areas to have discussion, and those groups will have representation from the provinces and from the local level. But as I said, your suggestions well taken, and I will be communicating your suggestion to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asif Khan, for your questions. We have time is of consideration, and so we'll move to the next person, Mr. Muhammad Faisal Sharif, if you could kindly, ask your questions from one of the panelists.
Yeah, thank you, Humzah. Of course, these were very good presentations. I have a comments, observation than a question regarding Rafay's comments on energy sector, that why we are still going for fossil fuels and coal-based power projects. So in energy sector, we have some long-term agreements with IPPs, 30 years agreements. And then we have just started the development of third coal. And even then we have just 12% share of the coal in our energy mix. And last year we have 20% generation from coal in total electricity mix of the country. And we have 74% from the clean and renewable energy sources. And our carbon emissions are standing at 353 kilogram per kWh. That is lower than many of the OECD countries. And then we are targeting 200 gram kWh by 2030. So all these steps are obviously towards increasing the share of clean and green energy. And plus we are entering two major transformation in the energy sector. The one is electricity market transformation, and then second is the energy sector transition from fossil fuels towards clean and green energy. So all these initiatives are with the objective to reduce further the carbon emissions. And I think being a developing country, Pakistan is the only country which has so much focus on the green and clean energy, despite the fact that we have lowest per capita carbon emissions and we have lowest emissions from the power sector. Regarding cost of the renewable energy, there are some peculiar issues, like the cost of renewable energy is not as simple to compare with the fossil fuels due to intermittency and availability issues. Then we need the grid infrastructure strengthening and some other issues. But my purpose to intervene is just to give the clarity that being a country, Pakistan is focusing on clean and green energy with all the focus on climate and environments. And I have just one question from Hadika, like in the start of the presentation, she just mentioned the per capita number. So I would like if she can mention the source as well, because we have some different numbers. So that, and plus on carbon pricing, we are already working with the Ministry of Climate Change, and that is really a good initiative from the Ministry of Climate Change, but it needs a stakeholders consultation, particularly from energy sector, because we have major share of thermal resources. So any taxation on carbon can have adverse impact on the basket price. So these are just a few observations and just a small question from Hadika. Thank you so much.
Humzah, can I take a shot at answering?
Should I answer?
I would be happy to allow you to answer, Rafay. I don't know if it was a question. I think it was a statement, but please, yes, please answer.
It's fine to think that Pakistan's a low greenhouse gas emitter, but don't forget that, you know, on average, life expectancy in Pakistani cities is lost 2 years on account of air pollution, and in Lahore, a staggering 5 years. Most air pollutants are greenhouse gases, and you can't discount the immense public health disaster that air pollution is in Pakistan by just saying that, you know, we don't do much overall greenhouse gas production compared to China or to America. Don't forget what's happening here. Karol, you mentioned that the Center for Research in Air and Environment published a report in March of last year where they estimated that about 30,000 people would die prematurely on account of the air pollution from those energy sources. So just reflect for a moment the immense damage to lives and to environment from these sources of electricity. Now, I know you also mentioned that there are difficulties involved in renewables, and let me address one which I think is crucially important. It reminds me of the saying that the Stone Age didn't come to an end because we ran out of stones. Pakistan's energy system is such that it has to provide electricity to large cities, which are the major consumer of electricity. In order to do so, you need to have very large plants somewhere. So that's either based on where the dam can be located, or some source where the thermal energy can be generated without too much disruption to local populations. So you have huge power plants miles away from the major consumers of electricity, and this creates a transmission and distribution grid, a solid infrastructure that costs money and which takes people to run and operate. Renewable electricity does not rely on the grid. You can put a solar up on your house, you can put a fan on your house if you're in a wind tunnel, and all of a sudden you have your own electricity. What we have to think of is a way of replacing this hard infrastructure in a way that allows for those jobs to transition and also benefit from the advantages of cheap and healthy electricity from renewables. Thank you.
Thanks, Rafay.
Can I intervene?
I would say time is of the essence. We have other questions as well.
Yeah, just a 1 minute, just a small comment.
You have 1 minute.
Yeah, I have 1 minute. Like when we talk about the cost of the distributed generation, so we have a least cost generation plan, and we are targeting 30% by 2030. But under the least cost generation plan, we have just 12% of the non-committed projects. We have long-term agreements, so we have certain constraints. Like it is easy to say than done. Secondly, we need investments. Like the transition towards low carbon economy is challenging for many developed countries. And Pakistan being a developing country, having a lot of peculiar infrastructure issues, it's not easy. Like we cannot say just that we should move towards away from the large infrastructure, we should move towards the distributed generation. It needs a complete techno-economic analysis, and then based on certain numbers we can debate. But obviously we are moving towards the clean and green markets. So that is just a policy government Pakistan policy which I'm talking about, nothing out of the policies. So that is a direction where we are moving in next 10 years.
Thank you so much, Faisal. I would say though that every decision, every investment, every target needs to have climate and the environment at its core. And the reason I say that is because at the end of the day, we are suffering. Our children will suffer. The air quality we breathe is terrible. Karachi and Lahore rank amongst the cities that have the worst air quality. And I also have a big problem with the fact that all these discussions are, mostly surround climate, carbon. We don't consider methane. Methane is 86 times more potent than carbon, but it stays in the air much for a shorter time. And so it's a greenwash to think that, natural gas and we have this major technological lock-in for terminals as well as gas power plants. So I think we need to have a more holistic policy. As Rafay mentioned, that we have since 2016 we have had approximately 15 coal power projects. Before 2016, we only had 1 or 2. And so, yeah, we really need to focus on going forward rather than, looking backwards. Thank you so much. Mr. Naveed Ahmed, you're up.
Okay, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I would like to share my pessimism regarding our ability, our country's ability, or on a global level, the universal ability to control or mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions, because I'm kind of skeptical about renewable energy resources. I mean, even the solar power plants or the wind power plants, there's a lot of talk about it now, that the kind of material that we will need for batteries to store, because the supply is interruptible. So, I mean, there are many of research papers which discuss that it is physically not possible to have that much raw material for the batteries that we need to store the intermittent renewable energy. And in my opinion, I mean, the mitigation is possible only if we have negative growth or we have zero growth economy and we get rid of this capitalism. I mean, just to share, like my grandfather used less material, synthetic material than my father did, and then I consumed a lot more than my father did, and my children will then consume much more than I did. So this kind of growth is going on, and I'm not sure. So my question to the panelists is that do they really think that we will be able to control the greenhouse gas emissions, the population, the pollution and its adverse effects on the population in long run? Because I personally think that it's kind of not possible.
Right. So I'm guessing that was a statement that it's not possible, rather than a question from anyone in particular. I would say, just building on what Mr. Rafay said, that we can't take clean energy in an abstract. We need huge transmission distribution network. California regularly curtails significant amount of solar energy because they don't have the transmission distribution at peak generation, whereas Texas invested about $7 billion to get 30,000 megawatts of wind energy. And this notion that clean energy is actually detrimental to the grid, Germany and California and Texas all prove that the grid reliability was not jeopardized as a result of it. And so I think theoretically and practically we need to see things differently. Hadika or Karol or Rafay, would you want to respond to Mr. Naveed Ahmed's assertions?
Humzah, I'll just very briefly say, not being a climate scientist, my expectation nonetheless is that we can make good progress by deploying a whole variety of innovations, as well as committing much larger resources to addressing the problem. So thank you for the good examples from California particularly, and from Texas, which we appreciate. And I just want to say how very impressed I was with Hadika's presentation. So I'll turn the floor over to my colleagues on the panel for other comments. Thank you.
I believe Mr. Rafay dropped out, unfortunately. Hadika, do you have any comments before we end?
Yeah, thank you, Humzah. No specific comments, and for Faisal Saab, I've shared the link on the chat, and if you can please also share the updated figure you have. Maybe that one is right, so I will be using that from now on. And just to say that renewable energy is very pivotal to our goals, and if Pakistan wants to be a leader globally on climate change, and all our current work and planned work is in line with that. There are challenges, I know, especially when it comes to renewable energy due to our indigenous coal and weak grid infrastructure. But nevertheless, I think renewable energy and hydro will be a pivotal part of our energy mix in the coming years. And we definitely be doing better than most of it, not all in the sector as well. So I believe that I want to be optimistic. Navisa, I get your point, but we still have a lot of a lot is going on, and a lot is in the pipeline. So just want to be optimistic. And I agree, Humzah, that this is a very serious issue when we talk about air pollution. And I won't be saying that what government and what the agencies are doing is perfect and up to the mark, and like all the areas, there are gaps. But I certainly believe that this government, not that I'm representing them, but as a Pakistani as well, under the leadership of Imran Khan, we have done more than we have done previously. And there's more seriousness and more willingness and this enthusiasm to do more. So thank you so much. That's it for me.
Thanks, Hadika. Rafay, before we ask you to give your concluding remarks, I did have a question about, since you're on the council, I did have a question. If you could speak more about the adaptation and mitigation frameworks that the Ministry of Climate Change is undertaking, but as you mentioned, it has never convened. I'm guessing I can scrap that question altogether.
Yes, you can.
That is not nice. Before, I mean, in your concluding remarks, just, as individuals, we see a lot of deflection campaigns. We see a lot of distractions. But by the way, there's this bookstore, The Last Bookshop. They have a great book, The New Climate War by Michael Mann, and I would recommend you all to read it. It's heart-wrenching to see the doubts that have been sowed in all of us. But I think the recent IPCC report takes all doubts out of question. It says it's unequivocal. The governments, the politicians, they've known it since 1950s, 1960s, that carbon emissions, methane emissions warm the planet. We have seen this coming. You mentioned about the NDCs, they're not enough. Where do we go from here? Is there a lack of political will? And if it is, what should we seek from our politicians, from our representatives? Should we inquire? Should we hassle? How should we go forward?
Thank you. The difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming has been confirmed by the 5th IPCC report to be about 150 million deaths that will take place mostly in the cities of Asia and Africa, and that too on account of air pollution, mostly from the transport and energy sector. 150 million deaths is 4 times the number of people who died in World War I and World War II put together. The 6th IPCC states that we'll go past 2 degrees by the middle of this century. This is a catastrophe that's playing out in front of us, and I fear many of us do not comprehend the severity of the climate crisis. Beyond 2 degrees, at 3 degrees, there will be food shortages. Beyond that, I don't think there's a tree alive that can survive the changes in temperature. And what will start happening is a rather rapid unraveling of civilization, not an extinction, but the bonds that keep us together. This is our future. It's very, very challenging, and it's something we're all going to live through. I beg you all to recognize these things and understand it's not about just you and me, but the incredible systems we have here on Earth, those of business, of capitalism, of patriarchy, of consumerism that have brought us here, and encourage you to think of a new way of living in this planet without destroying it for ourselves and our children. Thank you.
Yeah, and I believe one of the reasons that you and I insist on the IPCC report is because there's very little doubt that there's any bias when it comes to the IPCC. It's the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel. The executive summary of 39 pages is vetted by each and every government. And so there's a lot of emphasis on ensuring that every government is okay with it. The book that I was talking about talks about how in the second IPCC report, the government of Saudi Arabia was not happy with the word that humans have an appreciable cause on climate change. And so they watered it down to discernible. And so I think that's one of the reasons that, Rafay and I focus so much on IPCC reports to back our claims. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you all. I really enjoyed the talks from Karol, Hadika, and Rafay. Thank you so much, Runisa, for your welcoming remarks and for giving us the direction that the current US government is going in. If you could just kindly, conclude the session, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Thank you, Humzah, for your great moderation. And of course, to our esteemed panelists, you all have highlighted, of course, all of our efforts ongoing in the United States and Pakistan. And I really look forward to further working with this group and our colleagues across both countries to discuss these ever important issues. So thank you again for your participation and looking forward to our next gathering. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure having you all. And we are inshallah going to meet soon next week, next month with another topic and with our amazing panel, inshallah. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Bye-bye. Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz.